Without further ado, let's introduce our first guest. You are an author and journalist visiting from the US, already appeared on the stage. Daniel Pink, thank you very much for being here with us in the live studio as well.
I'm glad to be here with you, Maddie.
For anyone that missed your speech, what were the key takeaways?
Well, I talked about timing and how there's a huge body of research showing that when we make our decisions about when to do things, we can use real evidence. And so when we make our decisions about when to do things at an individual level, organizational level, we usually make them we make them based on default settings, we make them based on guesses, and that's the wrong way to do it. There's a rich body of science that helps us make better, smarter, more strategic decisions about when to do things.
Okay, moving on from that, I want to focus a little bit more on what motivates people at work and the future of work. This is something you've also had a lot of expertise in. 10 years ago, I think you wrote your book and gave a TED talk about this 10 years ago, about what motivates people at work. How much do you think has changed in the last 10 years in terms of what employees expect?
I think there's been a modest amount of change. I mean, basically what we know from this, again, that's also based on research. What we know from 50 years of research in behavioral science is that motivation is really complicated. A lot of times in organizations, we think it's just a matter about dangling a carrot in front of somebody or threatening them with a stick, and when in fact it's much more complicated than that. Especially when you want people to do more creative, conceptual, long-term kinds of things.
Okay, we'll pick up on that in a minute. I just want to say to the audience, thanks very much for being here, and to let you know who else we've got coming up, because I know, as they were saying on the main stage, there's a big queue for taxis. There's people wondering whether to stick around or not. So not only do we have Daniel Pink here, we've got Steve Wozniak, co-founder of Apple. He's going to be here with us as well. And we've also got Karolina Jarenko. She's the head of content at Philosophy and Academia, a huge consulting firm based here in the Nordic. So do stick around for those two as well. So let's talk a little bit more about then employee motivation.
Sure.
I'd like to know if you've got any best practice examples for us of people who have successfully shifted their approach.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about let's take a step back and talk about what we know. All right, and here's what we know. There's a certain kind of motivator that we use in organizations. Psychologists call it a controlling contingent motivator. It's too complicated. I call it an if-then reward. If you do this, then you get that. If you do this, then we get that. Here's what we know about if-then rewards, which are the mainstay rewards. If-then rewards are extremely effective for simple tasks with short time horizons. They work actually quite well. Why is that? Because human beings love rewards. So they get our attention in a focused way. That's a very good way to look at a problem if you know exactly what you need to do and you don't have to travel a very long distance. However, the same body of research tells us that if-then rewards are less good for more creative tasks with longer time horizons. Why? It's the same reason. If-then rewards get us to look at something narrowly. That's good if you know exactly what you need to do, but if you're not sure what to do, if the problem isn't clearly framed, if you want to be creative and take something from here and something from there and combine it, you want to look expansively. So if-then rewards don't work very well for more creative tasks. And what you have now, to get back to your question, Maddie, is you have companies trying to, ever so slowly, reckon with a new kind of motivation. And it's basically built like this. You have to pay people well. Money matters. It's not like again, there's subtlety to this research. The fact that human beings have intrinsic motivation doesn't mean that people don't care about money. Absolutely not. Money matters. But it's a threshold motivator. It just gets you through the door. Once you do that, you want people to have autonomy. Do they have some control over what they do, how they do it? You want mastery. Are they getting better at something that matters? Are they making progress? And then you want purpose. Are they making a difference and making a contribution? And so what you see now is around the world, certain companies doing certain kinds of things that together are effective.
Would you single out any for being
effective?
Sure,
I'll give you a company like, it's an Australian company around the world now called Atlassian. It's now a publicly held company. They do all kinds of things to promote autonomy. So they have, say, every quarter, they have what they call a ship it day. So people have 24 hours, work on whatever they want. All they have to do is show it to the rest of the team 24 hours later. Ship it day. And all these new ideas have come from that. They've done a very good job of reinventing performance reviews. So that what we know is that, from the research of Teresa Mobile at Harvard, is that the single greatest motivator day to day on the job is making progress. But in order to make progress, you need information. And so they have a new approach to performance reviews where people are getting much more quick, specific information on how they're doing.
So more of a continuous feedback model.
Exactly. Yeah. It's more. Well, I mean, again, we can call it continuous feedback. I think another way to look at it is to think about it as a conversation. I mean, basically, everything we know about feedback. I mean, here's the thing: it's so frustrating because we know. Let's talk about feedback here for a moment. We know a lot about feedback. All right. What we know about feedback, people talk about what's better: negative feedback, positive feedback. Doesn't matter. What we know is that the most effective feedback, it doesn't matter whether it's positive, doesn't matter whether it's negative. What matters is it actionable? That's the key. So people will respond to feedback. Feedback can be effective, whether it's positive or negative, if it's actionable. So if I say, so let's take, your producer here for this show, all right? Instead of saying, Maddie, good job, that was a good interview, she would be better off saying, Maddie, you know what? I really liked that follow-up question you asked when Dan gave this answer, okay? What's good about that? It's specific and it's actionable. You say, oh, good. Okay, so I'm going to use that kind of follow-up question again. If it was negative, it would be like, oh, man, he basically opened himself up for a question and you missed the follow-up, Maddie. What's wrong? You say, next time, what you should do is you should go in with that kind of follow-up in mind. So actionable. And the other thing that we know is that feedback is better when it's frequent and informal. That's your continuous feedback conversational. Frequent and informal, and yet most feedback systems and organizations are infrequent and formal.
Why?
Because that's a great question. I think
Thanks for the continuous feedback.
You should ask that question again. I'll give you the darker answer. I mean, I could come up with a more elaborate answer. I think the real dark answer is that's how we've always done it. And people aren't even thinking about it. They're just operating based on autopilot. The other thing is that feedback in an environment where people are doing purely routine mechanical work, whether it's with their body or with their brain, feedback is somewhat less necessary because it's clearer how you're doing. Oh, I turned the screw 100 times today rather than 98. Whereas if you're working as a journalist, or you're working at an ad agency, or you're working as a project manager or something like that, it's a little murkier. So you need that. And so what we're doing is we're relying on these very, very outdated systems. The other thing in the United States is that a lot of performance reviews are designed, unfortunately, as protection against litigation, at least in the United States. So, but again, we know a lot about feedback, we're just not doing it the right way.
When it comes to those traditional roles that you mentioned, where tasks are repetitive and perhaps there isn't the need for individual performance feedback on the day, I guess there's still the need for feedback from the other side. If people are expecting more from a company culture, or if trends are changing, or even just tension, in the workforce that managers might not know about, that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, and I think that there's, what's interesting, I think, is if you look at the universe of jobs in Finland or the universe of jobs in the UK or the US, the amount of work that is simple and routine is really shrinking. Most of that stuff gets done by machines now. So even think about something like processing an airline ticket at the airport. I mean, it's an algorithm. So you can go to a human being like you did 10 years ago, and the human being can print out your ticket, or you can go to the machine and it does the same thing. So a lot of that work is getting offloaded. I think that one of the most important things with people who are doing routine work is, and we have some good research on this as well, is that among the most important things you can do is explain to people why they're doing what they're doing. The reason that you are turning the same screw the same way is this. The reason we have to have you do this routine tasks the same way over and over again is for safety. Also, the reason you're doing this is that it contributes to a larger whole. And let me show you the end product, and let me show you how your piece contributed to that. So giving people some context, how they're making a contribution.
What about the physical workspace itself? There's been a lot of discussion about how to have different activity-based stations in areas, somewhere people can focus. We've seen the framery booths around here today, also sort of softer sofa areas. How much of an impact can they really make? We hear a lot about it, but has there been much research?
I don't know. I'm not sure about that. I actually tried one of those framery things today to prepare for my talk. I love that. I want to move into one of those. It's so quiet.
Be careful, you might not move out again. They are quite addictive.
They're fantastic. And so I don't think that there's a clear answer to that. I think it depends. If you think about, I think what we want, though, is that we want to give, I think more and more, we want to give the individual some autonomy over, where they work. And so there are people like me who could spend most of their time in one of those little boxes. But there are other people who'd be in one of those little boxes, and after a half an hour, they'd be going crazy. So you want people to have that. So I think what you do is the best architecture is one that allows people to configure things the way that's best for them. And what you want in general in white-collar workplaces is you want room for that quiet heads-down work, and you want some work for collaboration.
What do you think about remote working? So this brings us neatly onto some changes that are happening here in Finland. So there's a new law coming in next year which will allow workers to choose when and where they work for 50% of their working hours.
Wow.
And this isn't actually that controversial here in Finland. There have been a lot of discussions with unions, big companies, employees, and people think it'll work because there's a strong culture of trust here, and it's a smaller workforce in general.
Right.
Can you see remote working taking off? What do you think are the pros and cons?
I think there are pros, and that's incredibly interesting. And I think that it might be easier to do in a country like Finland than in larger countries. I mean, the United States is literally, 60 times the size of Finland, and probably has 60 times the labor market. I think the world should watch this. I think it's a really intriguing experiment for the world. I mean, again, on remote work. What we want is in white-collar work, there's certain things where you want to be heads down and on your own. And if people want to do that in a framery booth, if people want to do that in their kitchen table, to me, it's like they should have the sovereignty to do it that way. One of the things that you see in remote work, if there's too much of it, is that people start to underperform. If there's too much of it, generally it goes like this. So. You let people remote work, their performance goes up, but then at a certain point, it starts to dip back down. So, and I don't know what the right number is. 50% seems interesting. It's also going to be curious to see who actually takes it up.
Yeah, because a lot of people do want the structure of being in an office, having people around them for certain parts of the day. So it will be very
There could also be cultures where you say, well, of course, you have the freedom to spend 50% of your time on remote work, but it's looked down on internally, so even though you might have the legal right to it, the conditions of the culture are such that, see, Maddie's at her apartment half the time. Oh, she's not as committed as the rest of us.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting experiment.
Yeah, I'm almost never there. I need to be in a co-working space. I need people around me.
Do you really?
Yeah, even though I'm an introvert that sometimes needs my own space. But enough about me.
What do you like about it? What do you like about being around?
You see other people working. You see other people being productive.
I see.
So it feels like a space where you're supposed to work.
Interesting.
Even if you're not
talking.
That's
interesting.
And then, you get to know people. You have that 5-minute chat by the coffee machine like you do in any company, except you don't have to be nice to everyone because it's not a company you work for.
Right.
But listen, what's next for you? 3 bestsellers. You've been giving, a keynote speech on the stage. What can we expect from you next?
I'm going to write another book. I just haven't figured out what it's about yet. So if you have any ideas, I'll take it.
Maybe Finland and remote working.
Remote working in Finland. I'm not sure that's a book.
No, maybe a chapter.
Yeah, it might be like a pamphlet. A little pamphlet, yeah.
Do you have any other reflections from working in the Nordics and being around here?
I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting is that any kind of workplace, any kind of work is against a backdrop of the society itself. And one of the things that one of the things that I think about as an American is, you come to a place like Finland, and it is, if you look at the economic data, there are not vast inequalities here. In the U.S. and other parts of the West, there are huge inequalities. And that can be corrosive. And so the backdrop that companies are operating in is of huge inequality. And I think that's a big downside, and here's a model for that. On the other hand, if you go to the US, far bigger country, it's a much more diverse country than Finland. Finland is much more homogeneous than the US. And so the question, I think, is for societies is how do we get both, how do we eradicate inequality because it has a corrosive effect and maintain a level of diversity? And I think that's a challenge. And that's the backdrop of which every company operates, every person does their work.
Daniel Pink, wonderful to have you here
Thanks
on
for
the
having me.
Play stage. Let's give him a huge round of applause.
Thank you.